Okay, today I want to talk about book 3 of Plato's Republic. Let me just get up to the share screen here and we'll start off on that. I want to, now, Republic book 3, let me get that, there it is. As you can see here, where they're gesturing towards the little babies coming up from the ground. That's from another myth. But I put it on there because probably what book 3 is most famous for is the myth of the three metals, the gold, silver, and bronze, which is where we get it from. And the idea there is that there are some humans, they were all in the ground before they rose up out of the ground, so goes the myth. And some of them were near the gold, and some of them were near the silver, and some near the bronze or the tin. And that determines where they're going to end up in the Republic, in this rationalized society. And so, of course, that's one of the big points of criticism against Plato, this so-called noble lie that Plato wants to have this sort of myth that justifies the class system in the Republic. So that's something that really needs to be addressed if we're going to talk about the Republic book 3. However, before we do that, let me step out of this just again for a second. Before we do that, I do want to talk about what I take to be the central philosophical issue in book 3. And I want to do it in a way that just sort of facilitates discussion and gets us sort of into the philosophical issue a little bit more deeply. And that really has to do with the relationship between art and philosophy, and between art, particularly between art and Plato's metaphysics of form and matter, and the way that influences his view of art. And there's a lot going on with that. We know that the last two books of the Republic, books 9 and book 10, have a wonderful and fascinating discussion of aesthetics in terms of the form-matter distinction, the form-matter system of becoming, of coming to be and passing away. But book 3 also gets at this issue, and particularly at this issue of censorship. Another big criticism of Plato typically is that he's in favor of censorship because he's an authoritarian. It's this totalitarian state where he's banned the artist. There's a famous collection of essays by the great Platonic scholar Stanley Rosen called The War Between the Poets and the Philosophers, I think is the title of it. So I want to address that for the most part here in the beginning of our discussion of, yes, come up, or you, how about you, come up, anybody, come up. There we go, in our discussion of Republic book 3. So let's get on with that. First of all, there is a very funny passage in the beginning of book 3. I think it's one of the great comic passages in the Republic. Here we go, where an ongoing thing in the Republic is that Plato's two older brothers, Glaucon and Adimantas, are there at the festival with Socrates and the rest. And Glaucon is Socrates' tutee. They're kind of hanging out around together in a sort of organized way. But Adimantas and his friends have just run into them. And Adimantas is asking Socrates a lot of really over-literal questions about the Republic, which is a device that Plato is using to pretend as if Socrates is forced to talk about these aspects of the Republic that he doesn't really want to talk about. The way that it works is Socrates is speaking generally about what a revolutionary rationalized society would sort of be like. And Adimantas wants to answer questions like, well, what stories exactly, Socrates, would be the good stories? And which meters of music exactly would be the right meters of music that you would recommend? And Socrates doesn't really want to get into all. I mean, that's too specific for him. Adimantas, as I say, can't see the forest for the trees. Socrates is trying to impart his ideas, but Adimantas is forcing him all to all these specifics. I think sort of the culmination of that will be in book 5, of course, where Socrates gets kind of cornered into saying all these supposedly, right, according to the narrative that's being spun by our composer Plato, Socrates is kind of cornered by Adimantas into saying all these outrageous things about the family and women and private property and all this stuff that makes book 5 very notorious. Of course, we have a video on book 5 in the series as well. So let me just go through the slide here. Plato argues that the cosmos is divinely organized and mathematically coherent, and criticizes both the mythopoetic tradition of Homer and the reductive materialism of the Ionians. Okay, so that's a mouthful of stuff, but he's just got his Platonic philosophy, and he's talking about the kind of society that philosophy suggests one ought to have. But it's important, and he is at great pains to express this too, by the way, textually, in terms of the textual evidence, that obviously we're not pure form, we're form and matter. The human condition is to be sort of between the beasts and the angels that way, be material, incarnate, but participating in form, that part of us which is our share in the sort of transcendental form. And so beings like us, any beings in the material universe, any intelligible things, whether they're animals or just simply objects, any intelligible, recognizable, categorizable thing is a mix of form and matter, but the material part of it means that it can't be a perfectly formal thing. And again, that's sort of the paradox or tragedy of the human conditions, where Christianity and Islam get it from, along with from the Judaic tradition. They get it also from this Platonic tradition. So Plato our author doesn't really think that you could have the kalipalos, the perfect ideal state. It's a counterfactual. It's a thought experiment. It's a utopia. This is a work of utopian literature. Second bullet point, Plato does not believe an ordinary person could even conceivably be perfectly rational, since humans are a compound of form and matter. In fact, notice that he understands that part of the texture and depth of human life is being a material object. And Socrates' protagonist in particular is someone who's very devoted to the physical life and to human toughness, for example. Humans are a compound of form and matter. So at the beginning of book 3, we have a comic episode. And I think often these comic episodes, we don't see, they're not acted out well enough. In book 1, there's a comic episode when Thrasymachus is finally forced to recite his speech, and he does it in a sort of forced manner very quickly. There's a bunch of that kind, and it's so if that isn't sort of acted out in reading it, or at least in the minds, I think people sort of miss some of the humor there. In any event, throughout the Republic, third point, Adimantas, eldest brother of Glaucon and Plato, insists on specific details about the imaginary rationalized state, the Kallipolis, failing to grasp that Socrates is thinking philosophically. He can't see the forest of the trees. Socrates, who Adimantas is taking so seriously, turns out to be a Homer aficionado who can recite the juicy parts right along with the most prurient schoolboy. Adimantas never realizes he's being made fun of. So this is the joke. The joke of it goes like this, that Socrates is finally starting to get impatient with Adimantas, and Adimantas keeps asking, well, which stories would be the right sort of stories? And Socrates is objecting to the Homeric myths, because in the Homeric myths, the gods have all these flaws. The gods are jealous and envious, and they're also angry and rageful and violent. They're also duplicitous and dishonest and in disguise, and all sorts of things that that Socrates and Plato don't think an enlightened person should be like. And so what we're going to talk about, notice, in book 3 is this whole issue of mimesis, of imitation, representation, and the role that plays, it should play, should not play in art. That's really the big topic of book 3. So it starts off, then it turns out, because, the idea is, look, this world that we see in the Homeric mythopoeic tradition is not a Platonic world. It's a world of clashing, contradictory, paradoxical, irrational forces. And not only that, but as I mentioned on the slide, the new world of the naturalists, the Ionian naturalists, like the pre-Socratics, the Milesians, Heraclitus, and that gang, also are seeing a world like the world that maybe David Hume conjured, a world where there aren't any values and there are, again, just these sort of forces kind of crashing around. And that's the deeper, this is a cosmological interpretation of Plato that I'm offering you that I believe is a good one and that I find persuasive. That is that he thinks really this problem is thinking about the universe itself as a kind of valueless and paradoxical and random sort of place. And he doesn't think it is that. He thinks that it's an organized place that there, and he looks at mathematics and the transcendent and unified nature of mathematics, and he draws his inspiration, I think, from that. But meanwhile, Socrates is a man of the world, and Socrates really likes the Homeric stories, the stories that all the schoolboys want to hear. So the way the joke goes is this: Adimantas, the square, is saying, well, Socrates, which ones, I mean, shouldn't they listen to? And Socrates says, well, how about we'll get rid of stuff like this? And he's reciting this stuff all off the top of his head. And by the way, he's reciting it in the proper poetic meter as well, because later on in this same dialogue, he demonstrates what it would be like to recite the poetry without the heroic meter in a fascinating passage, but which also evidences the fact that in this case, he's reciting it properly. And of course, an educated Athenian gentleman would be able to recite these Homeric passages, much as a Victorian English person would be able, from their classical education, to recite many passages. And Socrates, as I say, is very worldly and clearly very much enjoys this wild Homeric stuff. So sort of a agreement. They're going down to talk to Achilles in Hades. I won't bother to go explain them all. I'm just going to read it out to you, sort of the sense of it. I would rather, so we shouldn't tell him, Adimantas. We shouldn't let him read stuff like this. I would rather labor on earth in service to another, to a man who is landless with little to live on, than be king over all the dead. It's this terrifying vision of Hades. He feared that his home should appear to gods and men dreadful, dank, and hated even by the gods. Alas, there survives in the hall of Hades a soul, a mere phantasm with its wits completely gone. And there are these passages with the souls in Hades, which are these like hysteric little bat things kind of flying around in space. And it's really creepy and scary. So what are these? These are the stories that the schoolboys want to hear when you're sort of sitting around the fire. Hey, recite that passage from Homer again, where he goes down to Hades and he sees the souls, and the souls are flying around. And he alone could think the others are flitting in shadows. The soul, leaving his limbs, made its way to Hades, lamenting its fate, leaving manhood and youth behind. Socrates is reciting all this to Adimantas, because Socrates knows all this by heart, because he thinks like most hip guys in Athens, I guess, knows his Homer, of course. His soul went below the earth like smoke, screeching as it went, as when bats in an awful cave fly around screeching if one of them falls. From the cluster on the ceiling, all clinging to one another, so their souls went screeching. The souls that are all up on the ceiling, and they flew all down on you and went flying away. It's pretty scary. Adimantas, huh? So we wouldn't let him read those, Adimantas, Socrates says. He's just completely pulling his leg. We wouldn't represent Achilles as the son of a goddess, right? I mean, you wouldn't say about Achilles, would you, Adimantas? You wouldn't talk about him lying now on his side, now on his back, now again on his belly, then standing up to wander distracted this way and that on the shore of the unharvested sea, the wine dark sea. Or Priam, a king descended by the gods, freaking out, losing it, rolling around in dung, calling upon each man by name. From the Iliad. Alas, unfortunate I am, wretched mother of a great son. Alas, with my own eyes, oh, the gods are lamenting. Unfortunate I am, wretched mother of a great son. The god, making a god lament, but real gods don't lament. Okay, alas, with my own eyes, I see a man who is most dear to me, chased around the city, and my heart laments. Woe is me that Sarpedon, who is most dear to me, should be fated to be killed by Patroclus, the son of Nochius, and so on. So the point then again is that it's very, very clear if we look at the text with the right kind of, frankly, emoting. And it really helps with these wonderful new translations, particularly the translations by C.D.C. Reeve, that's in the Collins collected works. That's what it is. Is it not? It is the John Cooper collected works of Plato that has the first translation by C.D.C. Reeve and an emendation of an older translation that really was a breakthrough. And you can also get a paperback from Hackett of C.D.C. Reeve's own translation of the Republic, which actually is not quite as colorful, but I recommend any of the two C.D.C. Reeve renditions of the Republic as just absolutely excellent, because you get those dramatic sort of intonations and emphases, so you can sort of see what's going on. And in this case, very, very clear that Adimantas is kind of a stick in the mud. He's kind of a square. He's not getting it. This is all kind of for instance stuff. And he's not getting it that we're not going to live in the Callipolis. We're not going to be those counterfactual beings. It's kind of like poly-fi, like you get sci-fi, science fiction. So you have these beings in science fiction and they're kind of counterfactual beings. Imagine that there were these Martians and they had this and they were like that. And there's kind of poly-fi when we're looking at a utopian or a dystopian work, this kind of work that we have in the Republic, whatever this is, because it doesn't fit our usual literary categories, I don't think. But again, in that case, that's just what we're looking at. Then what I was going to say is, then these people in it too, the three different classes that we find in the Republic, these are also poly-fi creatures, right? No one is really purely a member of the rational class. No one is purely a member of the appetitive class. You have a rational element, an appetitive element, a passionate element, shall we say, in you, constituting you. So that just follows again straight from the metaphysics itself. And Adimantas is kind of not getting it. Socrates, don't worry about Socrates. He's out there at the party, enjoying the body and creepy passages from Homer, just like everybody else. All right, so let's go back to our slides then. So he has this fun. Socrates, who Adimantas is taking so seriously, turns out to be the aficionado who knows all the good parts of Homer. And again, that's very much a setup and very much a commentary on what is now to come in Book 3, this discussion of the relationship between representation, mimesis, and the arts, and Plato's attitude towards the arts. Okay. All right. Okay. So art versus mimesis. So notice, first of all, I think something that would distort the discussion quite a bit is if you were thinking that representational arts were just synonymous with arts, because then, it sounds that way because it sounds like maybe he says he doesn't like paintings that much that are representational. Although I think that's actually, because of what I'm going to next say, I think that's actually kind of an interesting, there might be some depth to that. But because of this equivocation between artistic and representational in the minds, I think, of a lot of interpreters and readers of Plato, you get this idea that Plato is anti-art, that Plato doesn't like art in general. I think that is pretty bad mistake, and that's what I'm going to talk about for this slide and the next. Let's work through it. First of all, again, on the first slide, looking at a little bit of the metaphysics that's underlying everything always in Plato. Plato sees form as the sole source of intelligibility and value. Everything that you can identify as a thing is in this process of becoming. It's matter in the process of becoming, not becoming in the sense of appearing out of nowhere, but rather becoming in the sense of becoming something and then passing out of that existence. Plato has this notion of degrees of existence which is foreign to our notion of the concept, our concept of existence, by the way, where we think something either exists or it does not exist. It's there or it's not. And Plato is talking about existence in the sense of matter becoming more real the further it gets, the closer that it gets to form, the better approximation of form that it is. So there are degrees of reality. The important thing in terms of his problem with mimesis, with imitation, is roughly first bullet point there. I mean, the materiality, right, is the source of corruption. It is our material selves. Ideas are copies of forms. Think about the divided line, for example. Ideas are copies of forms, beliefs are copies of ideas, opinions copies of beliefs, solutions copies of opinions, and so on. So there's this sense of form unfolding through matter and through a series of copies of copies of copies. The farther away you get, then the farther away from authenticity you're getting. So anything then that's going to be a copy, anything that's going to be a representation of anything else is going to be, by definition, a kind of secondary thing and less of a thing for that. Second bullet point is really important. It's really hard to understand Plato and Aristotle if we don't sort of massage yourself a bit on this one. Crucially, this is not a Cartesian mind-body dualist metaphysics. It's a form-matter dualism. Me and this little square thing, there's a little cubey square thing right there. Okay, I got a little cubey square thing right there. It's a cube. Now, that thing is a cube. That is, it participates in form in as much as it has a geometrical form. And I participate in form in as much as I have, for example, a rational form, a logical, cognitive form. So me and that little square thing, me and the lozenge, that's a cough lozenge, we both participate in the one immortal soul, which is form, or the good rather, which is the thing that makes the world an intelligible place. And there isn't a distinction there between the mind and the body, notice, much at all. And notice also, just as a cube can be more of a cube or less of a cube, a square can be more of a square or less of a square, more of a circle or less of a circle, until eventually it's not a circle at all if it loses enough true, say. And perhaps a troubling but certainly an interesting consequence of Plato's metaphysics is that it looks like a person can be more or less of a person. And in our social contract tradition of modern political philosophy, we don't like that. But that is what he thinks. But he also thinks that you can't have a polis, a community coming into being without citizens coming into being. And these two things are sort of coextensive. All right, so material things also exist by degrees along this continuum between formal being, goodness, and material disorganization, badness, or technically absence of goodness. There's only one source of value. There isn't a negative pole. All there is like a light shining in the darkness. All there is form. Form is the only thing that brings value into the universe at all, according to Plato. Now, and so again, the more, among other things, realizing one's formal self more and more would be then definitely shedding imitation more and more, moving towards authenticity, getting closer to form, among other things, such as rational coherence and so on, also has to do with authenticity, since it's becoming less of an imitation. Third bullet point then, as I was saying, Plato is routinely read as anti-art, the war between the poets and the philosophers. Routinely read as anti-art because of his criticisms of mimetic or representational art, and his insistence that art can only improve or degrade character. He's super socialistic about that, by the way, I mean, he thinks that, for example, Plato didn't make up the idea that music might be martial music or calming music, inspirational music or sad music. Damon, actually, who was part of the circle around Pericles, it was a musicologist, and one of the things he used to do for Pericles was organized the marches and the music. They looked after the music because they knew that it influenced people. Plato doesn't invent all that stuff. He really, really believes very, very strongly that art needs to be an expression of what's good in the society. He thinks it only can be, because he really doesn't. When I say that Plato doesn't think there is any such thing as bad art, I think what I mean by that is, if it's really art, then it's going to be improving us formally. I'm not sure. Anyway, maybe that's a little wandering. Let's look at the last point on the slide. Plato's rationalist revolution would, in fact, eliminate the distinction between art and all other productive activities. In the ideal Callipolis, everything would be art. And in this, Plato's very similar to a lot of modern thinkers. If you talk about the politicization of everything, where the stuff that you're consuming is coming from, how it was made, your style, your language. And so, among other things, then there's this kind of totalizing view, which I think is very much a contemporary kind of view. And I think it's unavoidable, and that everything is political. And Plato thinks everything is political just like that. Just like a modern person who thinks the personal is the political. Plato absolutely agrees with that. And Plato also believes that everything is aesthetic, and that ethics and aesthetics are one, because both ethics and aesthetics are expression of form, and form is a unity. So, Plato thinks, in other words, that one bad thing is to rope art off from everything else. There shouldn't even be the notion that there's art. This object over here is a work of art, or an art object, whereas those objects over there are not art objects. Plato thinks that in the Kallipolis, the ideal society, the rationalized society that none of us will ever see, then everyone would apply themselves to that expression. He sees a great deal of beauty in rationality and coherence and mathematics and logical thinking. I mean, that's the rationalist in him, right? He really does think that what is beautiful is coming out of order and symmetry and connection. Now, I also want to talk about the real Socrates. And people, there was a real Socrates. We have independent sources about him. There are even other writers, such as Xenophanes, who write Socratic dialogues. We also have Aristophanes, the comic playwright, for example, writes about Socrates in his plays, notably The Clouds. At the first production of The Clouds, Socrates was present and stood up and acknowledged the applause of the crowd when the play was premiered. And some of Plato's enemies were actually followers of Socrates, who thought that Plato was this sort of rich kid, poetry major, and from an oligarchic family connected with the oligarchs, who had sort of glommed on to Socrates, and they used to actually heckle Plato. So we want to look at Socrates, and an interesting question, of course, is, well, can we make a distinction between the thinking of Plato and the thinking of Socrates? There is an easy way to do that, that's right, and that is to notice that this form-matter distinction I'm talking about, and the systematic kind of application of that metaphysics to all of these applied topics, is really the great composition and masterpiece of Plato, our writer, and not Socrates. Socrates is a real person who, like every single other character in the Republic, is actually a real historical person who, for various reasons, Plato has chosen to put into this narrative. When I said earlier, it doesn't fit into our modern categories of literature very well. He doesn't have any fictional characters. So anyway, so the Greek Stoics are really, understanding them one understands Socrates. All the complaining about doctors and lawyers and people going to the doctor all the time through the Republic is all a reflection of Socrates. Second bullet point, Socrates advocated a kind of radical authenticity, his Stoic confidence. There's an avatar of Socrates that we find in Plato. Socrates is kind of disheveled and has kind of a dirty toga and kind of wears old sandals and hangs around down in the market all the time. This is actually a caricature of a Stoic, of a Greek Stoic person like Diogenes or someone like that, like Socrates, who was one of those kinds of people. And he had a hostility towards what he saw as the debilitating effects of too much culture. They're kind of Rousseauian that way. It's ultimately, third bullet point, ultimately an odd obsession to be always authentic and original. That is, it's pretty strange. You want to be always authentic. You probably have seen people or known people who didn't like pretense, who had a thing about people striking poses. There's a kind of Buddhist kind of paradox in there, because now you're striking the pose of not striking a pose, and I don't see how you can get out of it. So I just think the only thing to do if you're concerned about authenticity is to give it up. But that's just me talking, not Socrates. Socrates sort of thought that people should be originals somehow. It's a pretty radical idea. But look, some of it we can relate to. Not speak in cliches, not be a slave of conformity, not just think and dress and act and spend your free time the same way that everybody else in your community always does. I mean, we all, value these things that Socrates values. Socrates, he starts off in book 3 in the passages where he's doing this, the first half of the book. And he's pointing out things that any of us would sort of think of as reasonably, saying, well, for example, if he says, you wouldn't want to put yourself in the place or act like a bad person, because that might start to influence you to be a bad person. Well, then that goes from there. He goes, well, an actor, if they're acting out the part of a bad person, they may become influenced by becoming bad. Acting that way is going to make you that way. And so it would be bad for the artist, it would be bad for the actor, notice, or the poet to be creating portrayals of wicked beings, after all, not just for the people consuming the art, but for the makers of the art. This is going to have a bad effect on them, he says. He says, if you were reading this epic poetry, it might be okay for the poet to put themselves in the place of the noble hero and act as if they had those virtues. But it would be very bad for them to actually act out the parts of the bad people or the suffering people, the weak people, any of the negative stuff. He says they probably shouldn't do that. And that's getting pretty radical. And that's where they have the discussion of, reciting Homeric verse, but not in meter and all that. Then he goes further too. He says, you wouldn't want to bark like a dog. You wouldn't want to baa like a sheep. I mean, you're acting like an animal. You're gonna make yourself sort of, I guess, unto as an animal or something if you do too much of that. You shouldn't be pretending to be an animal. It's not good for you. And then it even goes further than that. And he says some of these people become so shameless that when they're performing for other people, somehow telling jokes or talking or whatever, make sounds like springs, boing, and creaking doors, and thuds and like dunk and stuff like that. And he says, that's really bad, acting like physical objects, making sounds like physical objects. Now, at that point, right, don't we start to say, that's a little crazy, isn't it, you guys? I mean, after all, you really are saying I shouldn't go vroom, vroom like a car, because I might start to be like a car and that's bad for me? Seems a bit much, but yeah, they go there. And again, one thing is that this is definitely, among other things, this is Socrates. The real Socrates had this kind of vision. It's an interesting thing to think about, of people who really did not do any mimesis, who really did not do any imitation at all. As I say, I've met people in real life who had a sort of fetish about authenticity, and I find them kind of tiresome because it seems futile. Last bullet point, it would be supremely difficult to maintain such a stance. It really would be. It's the psychological equivalent of swearing off material possessions. What do I mean by that? well, you know, I have a house and I have a car and I have all this junk. And I also have, you know, a culture and identity and all these ideas and attitudes and party affiliations and all kinds of stuff. And Socrates is maybe sort of saying, you know, clear all the stuff out of your mind, just like you should clear all that junk out of your house. So you really don't need all that stuff. And so think of the Stoic figure Diogenes, who was actually kind of Dadaist street artist at his time, a little bit later when philosophy was getting a little decadent during the Hellenic period. And Diogenes, of course, the person living in a barrel and doing Dada street stuff, like walking around with a lamp during the day and saying he's looking for an honest person, stuff like that. And, you know, one way you have to see Socrates to understand him is he is in that sort of Stoic tradition, which became very colorful later on when, you know, when it started to get like that. Okay. So then this is really the meat of it, is what can we say about Plato's attitude towards art? Because remember, again, as a teacher who'd been going over this stuff with, you know, crowds of new people over and over for a long time, I know that this is one of the points where people will bridle, and man, they can. I'm not an apologist for Plato. I'm not trying to get people to, I'm not trying to persuade people that Plato's right. But this is one of this all these anti-art, he's a censor, and that's part of his totalitarian thinking, and that's bad. I think we can be a little bit more nuanced about that. I think it's important that we do that if we're going to get to some of the interesting ideas that really are here in this text. We already know a little bit about Plato's aesthetics. We know that he thinks that all value comes from form, that aesthetic value, beauty, in that classical sense, is also going to come from form. It's going to be an expression of underlying mathematical, formal, logical sort of unity and coherence and design. And that's what we find to be beautiful, because that's what causes things to be recognizable things. That's the only source of value. So we know that. So first bullet point, Plato's attitude towards art and aesthetic experience is deeply intertwined with this underlying metaphysics of form-matter dualism. I think that's clear enough. On this view, intelligible, that is nameable, identifiable things become more real as they participate further in form, which means roughly mathematical organization. Okay. Plato's theory is univocal, form's the only source of value. So ethical and aesthetic imperatives are subsets of this larger existential imperative to seek further realization of formal being, like Jesuits' Christ, always approachable, never attainable. That's sort of the human project. We are incarnate. We can rise towards the form, but as we are incarnate material beings, we can never shed that and experience pure form. That's why at the end of the dialogue, the Phaedo, Plato is so happy to let go of his body, because he's going to be able, he thinks, to be experience pure formal being rather than formal being polluted with material being. So third bullet point, then, something that came out of this for me anyway, this view emphasizes not only these Apollonian Platonic values of symmetry and order, right, that Nietzsche sort of set himself up against, but also then authenticity. Because on the theory of form matter and the interaction of matter with form, copies and reflections are of secondary worth. The copy is always going to be not as valuable as the original thing of which it is a copy. And we can rise up through those levels of beings as rational beings and become closer to the form, as was practiced by Pythagoreans for a long time before Plato wrote this, and then carried on in Plato's Academy, the same kind of practice, doing geometry proofs, logic proofs, in order to clear the mind. Okay. So last bullet point. As I was saying, it's a standard interpretation to read Plato as anti-art, equating art with representation. He is allergic to mimesis, imitation, but he has a totalizing view of art that I say there is as intriguing as it is ambitious. Everything is art. He has an important sense strongly pro-art, sort of the ultimate pro-artist. Only the notion of imitation doesn't have any role to play in his notion of art. Plato's vision of the Callipolis, his revolutionary rationalist city, is a place where every human artifact, every single thing, every piece of architecture, every implement or utensil, every single thing. Think about decoration. It's fashioned with the utmost attention to art, craft, and taste. It looks like he's almost got a sort of Swedish furniture, like form follows function kind of aesthetic going, maybe. But nothing would be shoddy. Everything would be done with the utmost attention. It would be a beautiful, elegant place. All the banisters, all the walls, all the pavements, everything would be very beautiful. Everything would be very tastefully done. What it would not have would be representational art, which not only comes between the viewers and reality, right? So you're looking at an imitation, you're not looking at the real thing. Much more divorced from reality. But as I mentioned, it's also an activity unbefitting the artist, who ought to be living their own authentic life instead of practicing mimesis. Mimesis is imitating things is very bad for the imitator because they're losing themselves in the thing. Just like the form is losing itself in the matter. So as I went on about before, the third bullet point there, Plato is like many modern thinkers that he recognized that everything in human life is freighted with aesthetics, ethics, and politics, and they're all one. And the personal is the political, and society is one big organism. You know, that's his view. So again, I think a lot of people really misunderstand. I mean, they think they're looking at some kind of dictator who wants to stamp out the artist. Excuse me, very far from true. In Plato's totalizing vision of art as everything, and everything is art, we can get a glimpse of Socrates' impossible injunction to originality. Plato's picture of art, I'm saying, in the Republic, is a kind of version of what Socrates thinks you should bring to sort of your presentation of self. We shouldn't even have a presentation of self, to a sort of way that you live. But, you know, again, as you know, I think it's clear enough that what Socrates wants is really impossible. I mean, we're social beings. There's an interesting conflict there, notice, between Socrates and Plato. Socrates seems to be a kind of ultimate individualist in as much as no one should ever conform or pick up on cliches or even use the same linguistic patterns as other people, according to Socrates. And Plato's a kind of communist, you know, I don't say that positively or negatively, just pointing out that's really what he is. I mean, he's an organic theorist who thinks that the whole society is one big organism, and that everything is, then the justice is everything being in its proper place in that sense, as an organismic social theory. And this again means that, you know, the value is seen in everything. All right. So let me step out for a sec. So that's really the main message that I would have, you know, today in this video in terms of looking at book 3. I would say that we underestimate, you know, without being some sort of defender or something of Plato, I would say we very much underestimate how sophisticated his theory of aesthetics really is. And we can even start to motivate his objections to imitation a bit. We can also, I think, in this chapter, all through book 3, I think we get interesting glimpses of the real Socrates. I think that's an interesting subtext of book 3. And now I want to spend just a minute talking about another issue, which is probably the most notorious issue in book 3, which is, it's often called the noble lie. I'm not sure that's actually the way that Plato would have us record translating that. I use the term the noble myth. And I just want to say just a thing or two about this, because as I say, there's a standard objection that I get from crowds of people when we're studying this, that again, he's a totalitarian, he's telling people lies, he's manipulating the public, he's, you know, he's Dr. No. Book 3 contains the notorious passage where Socrates proposes promulgating an origin myth. He's got an origin myth. It's a utopian work and has an origin myth where you had the Athenians were under the ground and sort of embryo before they came up. And some of them were near the gold and some near the silver and some near the bronze. This myth is meant to justify the tripartite organization of society. The rulers, then the the guardians and the auxiliaries, who are sort of the keeping the balance, and then the passionate or functional element. I have two things to say. First, the last bullet point on this slide is one that I think, just in terms of, again, being an expositor and a teacher of Plato. Look, in mid-millennial Greece, just about like everywhere else that we look in history, in all times and places, political organizations, both fictional and real, nations and peoples, both fictional and real, really pretty much all tend to come with origin myths. That's even a standard thing you're going to learn if you take your sort of introduction to anthropology class. And yes, indeed, there is definitely an anthropological reading of Plato that I think also is persuasive and scans in a lot of interesting ways. No poet or political theorist at a time when many writers were both would have omitted a significant origin myth of some sort. It was not only a staid literary convention in the 4th century you just expect in any kind of utopian work such as this, that there would be an origin myth. You expect in any kind of epic poem about some people or some nation or some hero that there would be an origin myth, just absolutely standard literary component. It would have been weird if he hadn't had an origin myth. And he has more and different origin myths in, for example, the Timaeus, where he really gets into cosmological and mythological matters. And it's also, again, the last thing, also a standard device for developing and maintaining cultural cohesion. And there's the anthropologist. This is social engineering. It is what it appears. It's only that, again, I mentioned before, he refers to Damon, who was kind of the political musicologist for Pericles. I mean, he's just a sophisticated person. It's not like he's making this stuff up. It's not like he's Machiavelli, really. So I think that's an oversimplistic or reductive reading and criticism of Plato. That he sort of somehow made up the idea that we're going to have self-justifying myths. However, I do have a criticism of Plato, in particular of the tripartite structure of the Republic, both politically and psychologically. I think there's a way that he kind of goes wrong in that. And so that's the last thing I want to say. The noble myth of Book 3 is an example of a larger problem with the composition of the Republic and the theory itself. Plato has a tight composition where both polis and psyche and every other intelligible thing are compositionally identical to the central form matter, metaphysics. I mean, that was his revelation, right? At some point, Plato, coming up to the time around 375 BC, the first half of the 4th century, composed the Republic. He clearly had one of those great compositional, when you're trying to figure out how to do something, and he realized the application, that he's got the form matter distinction, that what he wanted to say about society mapped onto the form matter distinction. It is a really tight composition with a formal element, material element, acting through the agency of the third element, the disciplinary element. And he applies that to ethics, politics, aesthetics, epistemology, psychology, you name it. The problem, and again, I think this is a problem with the whole sort of class structure in the Kallipolis, although they're not really classes, right? The guardians aren't really a class, they don't have any material possessions. It's not a socioeconomic class structure. But anyway, the problem is, I think, that he doesn't get it, that if you see that every material thing is becoming, it's coming into form and passing out of form, then that really implies a sort of totalizing meritocracy. He says, for example, in Book 5, that you're going to have lotteries, you're going to have testing, you're going to sort people out by merit. There isn't ultimately, if the metaphysics, I think, is followed through, any justification for having a formal or fixed class structure much at all. Maybe some functional one. But I think Plato ultimately gets in his own way. This is my basic criticism of Plato and the Republic. I think he basically gets in his own way. He's got to have his composition. He's got to have his tripartite structure, come what may, because that's his great compositional inspiration. But that's too bad, because actually there's a further step there where you realize that it dissolves away these what are essentially irrational distinctions, or something like that. I'm just me. I'm just this guy. The last bullet point, I will not defend Plato from the charge that the sympathy with the oligarchic faction may have contributed to this shortcoming, if it is a shortcoming. Maybe so. Again, I'm not a defender of Plato. Okay. So anyway, book 3, and flag a couple things. Notably, it looks to me as if it's a serious misreading of Plato to say that he's anti-art. He's extremely pro-art, but he wants everything to be art. And he wants it to be of a particular kind of art, a particular kind of self-expression, authenticity, which, we haven't plumbed the depths of. I mean, what are we talking about when we talk about being authentic and being an authentic artist who isn't a product of some system of convention and socialization and some symbol system? What would that be like? It's an interesting question. So reading the book, trying to use the text the way it's supposed to be used in this tradition, that is as soteriological, that is supposed to change our lives. If we consider it and think about what it says, it might make a difference and actually change us, not something to be just passively read, but rather something to be experienced in terms of our own cultivation of ourselves. Oh, anyway, enough of that. All right, so that's book 3 of the Republic, and thanks for your attention.